Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell. We'd like to say very, very happy good evening to you. Hope that you're doing well, you're keeping safe, and that you have a great time in, first of all, this change of weather that seems to be a lot more pleasant than what we've had in recent weeks. But at the same time, an opportunity for you to get out and just enjoy, being outside and out of the house without having to freeze your little toes and bones off. All right. Well, anyway, with us, of course, is Dr. Don Preston. We are delighted to be with him as well. So, Don, how are you doing? What's going on in your world? And what's the latest update?
Well, just it's been a wonderful week. Like you say, the weather's just been absolutely beautiful, and like you, really, really enjoying it, and it gives you spring fever, when you get just a little bit of flavor of it. And if nothing happens, then I'm going to be able to go to an automotive swap meet this weekend. I can't wait. It's really exciting to be able to think about getting back into the car hobby and into the swap meet season. I was commenting to my wife today that evidently the word's getting out that being at an outdoor swap meet really honestly poses very little threat, or seemingly so. And so some of the swap meets that closed down earlier last year are now open this year. So I've got the fever. I'm ready to go. And I'm going to set up this weekend. I'll see if I can't sell some old parts and make a few bucks off of that, and clear out a little bit of space so I can go buy some more stuff. You know how the addictive hobby is that the only reason you sell stuff is so that you can buy more stuff. That's just the way that works. But anyway. Really, really enjoying this beautiful weather, and just enjoying corresponding with an awful lot of folks who have contacted me recently, and they're super excited about covenant eschatology. I've been enjoying so much corresponding with a couple of people who have come out of the dispensational world as a result of your ministry and mine. I've been corresponding with some people who have come out of the Torah observant movement, and they're very, very excited. They're just enjoying the freedom that they are experiencing. And so that type of thing, the correspondence that goes along with that, of course, I've been putting up with correspondence from some folks who they get on my YouTube or they get on Facebook, and they do nothing but throw insults. I told one today, I told one guy, I think he's a relatively young guy, and to be honest about it, I don't know any other way to express this except I had completely, thoroughly embarrassed him insofar as his really, really bad argumentation, so much so that he basically disappeared for a little bit. And then he came back today throwing out more insults, completely, totally ignoring the previous arguments that I had made, which, like I said, completely debunked everything that he had said earlier. So he had completely ignored all of that, and then came back today throwing out a whole bunch of – he made no attempt whatsoever to make an argument. He made a whole lot of claims, threw out a lot of verbiage, created a lot of smoke and a lot of dust, and that was it, with lots of insults. So I'd had about enough of it, to be honest about it. So I posted a message to him. I said, if you are willing to come on here and make arguments with Scripture and attempt to make a solid exegetical argument, backing it up with sound logic, you're more than welcome on my YouTube channel. But if all you're going to do is to come on here and do what you just did, and that's do nothing but throw insults, make false accusations, offering no proof whatsoever except your presuppositional, unfounded, and unproven claims, I said, then don't even bother posting, because I'm not going to put up with it. Don't have time for it, don't have interest in it. So you either make good arguments or try to make good arguments. I don't think I'm capable of it. But you at least attempt to make a good argument, or don't make an argument at all. Or, don't come on here, and most assuredly don't throw around your insults. I'm not going to put up with it. And so that it's actually been sort of a productive week in regard to that. I guess the most gratifying has been the correspondence with people who have left the dispensational world or the Torah observant world, and they're just so thrilled right now with what they are learning, and the joy that they're feeling. That it's always gratifying to be able to correspond with people like that, to hear from people like that, and to know the impact that our ministries are having. It's really cool.
Yeah, well, that's very good. A couple of things that you spoke about. One, of course, with people with the from the Torah movement background. One of the things that you find with them is that, at least I have experienced, has been such a rich knowledge of the Old Testament that they bring, and a lot of the insights on many of those questions like feast days and various other things that. Unless you're kind of soaked into that Old Testament, the Torah and the Tanakh, you happen to miss, which is typical of those who come from our background, where we, placed so much emphasis on the New Testament apart from the Old, seeing them almost as, disconnected altogether. So when you hear some of that, rich information that they bring, it's quite refreshing, and especially when you have the background in eschatology, that you can see almost readily how it fits together. It makes for some really, really exciting Bible study. So, that's one thing.
It really does.
Yeah.
One particular individual that I've been corresponding with is another individual that came out of the Torah observant movement. And this individual has told me repeatedly that their exposure to the Torah observant movement is really what led them directly to covenant eschatology, because once they saw the significance of the feast days, they began to see the problems within the Torah observant movement. And then when they heard lessons from preterists, they heard lessons from men like you and me, and from Dave Curtis. So when they heard preterists tying in the feast days with actual fulfillment within a temporal framework that is completely, totally violated by the dispensational paradigm, I mean, it blew them away, and they were just thrilled absolutely to death in order to accept covenant eschatology. So that's the kind of people I've been corresponding with lately, and it's just really exciting.
Yeah, it really is, makes for some very rich Bible study, and just sometimes you just sit back in awe and learn from them because of the the information that they have. So that's very good. I've just finished up a written debate on Solomon Vito's platform. And that had been going on for some time. Kind of got stalled a little bit because of the Q&A that we were doing at the end, where we were doing cross-examination and questions. And so basically, what happened is I submitted my questions to the gentleman, and he answered those, and then he submitted his to me, and I responded to him. But one of the things that he tried to do was, we were supposed to submit 7 questions. And he was basically trying to ask me 3 or 4 questions within one. And I said, no, we're not going to play that game. And once I did answer them, and I ended up, I think by the time we got to the end and he revised his questions, what I had asked him to do was to revise them and send me another, list of questions that he wanted. Well, he never did. So I was forced to just pick the questions myself. So I just picked out some that I was going to answer, and I sent him 4 back. And then because it had been so long, I'd lost track of how many we were supposed to do. And so he said, no, it's supposed to be 7 questions. I said, fine. I said, well, I'll answer 3. Give me any 3 you want from your list, and I'll do it. Oh, he got upset and wanted me to go back and re-answer a question that I had picked out when he had over a week to tell me which questions he wanted answered, and he never did. And so I said, well, look, I'm not going to go back and answer any more questions. I will answer any 3 from your list of the 4 that you claim were remaining. I said, so you pick them out. But I went back and, I did answer all of them just because, it wasn't going to help his case any in doing it. But before I did that, he quit the debate. He says, he says, I'm done. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And just quit. And I told him, I said, well, if you quit at this point, you forfeit the debate. And I haven't heard from him since. But that's how that situation turned out. And I still, basically answered all of his questions. I think it was only one of them. I just said, well, here's the short answer to that. It was kind of a yes or no question, but he wanted an explanation. I said, if anybody wants this question, further elaborated on, I said, ask it in the audience Q&A, and then I will address it. I said, but I think I ended up answering 9 questions for him in that exchange. But anyway, I think people were edified throughout the discussion. It was good having it, and but that's what happened with that particular one.
Well, and let's face it. I mean, yeah, it's just more than obvious. Anytime a man just quits in the middle, so to speak, of a debate, he has literally raised the white flag.
Yes.
He has told anyone who is reading or listening, as the case might be, he has told them, I can't answer this. I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. Don't know what to say. So I'm withdrawing. I had a person do that to me in a written debate on the internet some years ago. I've forgotten now exactly which forum it was, but he had challenged me on the internet, and I told him be glad to enter into a written debate with you. So we proceeded. We drafted our propositions. He submitted his very first affirmative. I answered it. I submitted an affirmative, and he posted immediately after receiving my affirmative. He said, I'm withdrawing. I'm not qualified to discuss these issues. And so it was like, wow, that's quite an admission to say I'm not qualified to enter into this discussion. I had felt like he was rather naive. He seemed like a really nice guy, to be honest about it, in our correspondence. He never got hateful. He never got ugly. He never got out of the way. And so I honestly felt, even in the early stage of the negotiations, based upon a lot of the comments that he said, I just didn't feel like he was prepared to actually debate the issues. And then, like I said, sure enough, after 3 presentations, he was done. He was through. So, and speaking of debates. I won't mention any. I won't mention any names at this point, but you need to know. I sent you a book today. You know, another one of those situations where Preston somehow or other ordered two. Yeah. Hey, you know what? One of these days, I'm going to send you a bill for every single book I've ever sent you, and I'll be able to retire. You know, folks, I got to tell you, and I'm going to get myself in real trouble here. I really am, but my wife's in the other room. She'll undoubtedly come in here when I get through telling this story. We get the biggest bang out of the fact that we'll go shopping, and she'll say, I don't think we got any peanut butter. And I said, no, I think we do. And we get home, and we've got 14 jars of peanut butter. Or, you know, it may be jelly, or it may be this, or it may be that. No, I don't think we've got any. I said, well, I don't know. You know, go ahead and get some. And I can tell you right now, we will be well supplied throughout the Holocaust on some of these items. Well, guess what, folks? Preston has done that in the purchase of books. I literally cannot tell you the number of times I have purchased a book going, oh, man, I got to have this. And then when the book arrived, there were 2 copies of it. And I'm going, I don't remember buying 2 copies of this. Well, I didn't need 2 copies. So I'd call William up, and I said, do you have the following book? Well, no. I said, well, you're about to. So I'd send it to him. That happened again today. I already had a copy of this book, and about all I'll say about the book at this particular point is it is a very, very unique take. It is written by a Baptist, a well-seasoned, well-educated Baptist minister, and it has to do with the millennium. And the only distance further I'll go is this Baptist minister says and teaches in the book that the second coming was in AD 70. But that we're in the millennium now. We are waiting for the end of the millennium. Obviously, there's some people out there that have taken the idea that the millennium began in AD 70. That's been a view within the preterist movement now for some few years. It is not a standard view. It's not a historical view by any stretch of the imagination. And so in this book, what's interesting is that he has some review quotes from some very, very prominent Baptist ministers and professors, college professors, who are advocating and promoting his view. And again, I'm not going to name any names, but I received today confirmation that we have a verbal agreement for he and me to engage in a formal written debate on his view. Seemed like a really nice guy, and so I'm anxious for us to get down to the brass tacks of our negotiations and to get everything all set up. It promises to be a very, very interesting debate. I mean, after all, when you got 2 people agreeing that the second coming was in AD 70, certainly on one ground, in one way, you would go, okay, what is there to debate? And yet he has a very distinctive view, and so we'll be discussing that. So anyway, you have a book coming, William.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I got to stop doing that. Okay. Well, listen, folks, I want to get into our lesson tonight. And, you know, William, as I was studying and preparing for this evening, I think we've said, to be honest about it, I think we've said quite enough about chapter 45. And so in anticipation for tonight, I thought, okay, I got to reach through chapter 46. Now, there is one overwhelming, one dominating theme in chapter 46 of Ezekiel. And it is the observance of, number one, the Sabbath, and number two, the feast days of Israel. Now, as we've discussed before, William, the difficulty of reading and interpreting Ezekiel 40 to 47 is trying to determine what was messianic, what was non-messianic. And as I looked through chapter 46, I read it at least 3 times today. I just simply sat down, read the entire chapter. And I would read it, and I would read it, and I would read it, and I would read it. And I kept thinking to myself, I suspect that there are some older, and when I say older, I'm talking about 16th, 17th, 18th century Presbyterian Reformed scholars who probably had a field day discussing the type and antitype of what was being discussed in Ezekiel chapter 46. I couldn't find any of that writing, to be honest about it, earlier in the day, and so I probably just didn't look hard enough. But some of those older scholars in the Reformed Presbyterian movement were absolute masters at developing the type and the antitype, and seeing and developing these, for lack of better terminology, these hidden nuances in so many of these Old Testament texts. And I was disappointed in myself that I could not come up with some of those Presbyterian scholars from the 15th, 16th, 17th, or 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that I could delve into and to glean from them. But I just simply couldn't. Even though I looked, I just didn't find any of those scholars in their comments on these chapters. Not to put you on the spot, William, but are you familiar with any of that older scholarship that was so masterful in developing the type and antitype of, pardon me. Oh, my goodness, excuse me, folks. Of some of these Old Testament texts like Ezekiel 46.
No, I can't say that I'm familiar with that literature of which you specifically speak. As a body of literature. I mean, I've read some of the, I've read commentaries, etc., on it where you have them, and I have books on types and metaphors, etc., but none where it's been sort of a focused study in that particular area.
Okay. Well, I didn't know if you had or not, and I remember some years ago, Jack Scott sent me shows you how long ago it was, a cassette tape. And on my way to Abilene one year, I played that cassette, and the cassette was by a Presbyterian minister from that period of time that I'm talking about. And this particular minister was going through Leviticus, and he was talking about, and his entire premise was Hebrews 10, 1 and following, Hebrews 9, 6 to 10, Colossians 2, 14 to 17, where the writer tells us that the Old Covenant feasts were types and shadows of the better things to come. So this Presbyterian speaker, actually, I tell you, as I drove along, and I have not a clue what I did with that tape. I do not know where it went. I have wondered a million times what I did with that tape. But I want to tell you the depth of that scholar, that commentator's insight into the feast days was another one of those things. Along with Bill Kennengeiser, along with David Curtis, it was another one of those things that kick-started my intense interest in the feast days and their typological meaning. I was just literally blown away at the depth of his learning. And I would just, I mean, I kid you not, I would dearly love to be able to find that cassette tape again. I would have it converted into CD, MP3, whatever, and it would be a constant source of research for me. Because talk about good, it literally just uplifted the heart. It thrilled the mind to see the connections that this man was bringing out. It was just so rich, so full, so deep that, and you know, William, is like you and I have said on different occasions, and you touched on it just a little bit ago. All of a sudden, I mean, when you hear it, you could go, yeah, why haven't I seen those connections before? My goodness, that's good. And that's the kind of thing that was on this cassette tape. It was absolutely fantastic. So I apologize to the audience for not having a wealth of documentation, a wealth of commentator citations that I can cite to bring out what might be in Ezekiel 46. But the one thing that seems clear to me, and I might have to amend my view on this, but it seems like it's talking about historical observance of the feast days instead of the fulfillment in the millennial or the Messianic kingdom. It's one of those type of passages that when you read it, you do not get that sense of this is messianic. You get when you are reading passages that are talking about, quote, the last days, and passages that talk about the Messiah, because you don't even read about the Messiah in Ezekiel 40 to 47. Now you do read about the prince, and many commentators down through the centuries have said, well, even though the prince is mentioned and not the Messiah, the prince is actually the Messiah. Well, if that's true, I have a problem with that, to be honest about it, because in chapter 45, the prince offers sacrifices to make atonement for himself. So I've never felt comfortable that we're talking about the prince being the Messiah. I just don't think that will work at all. So let me read just a couple of verses here that give us a little bit of insight into what's talking about. Thus says the Lord God, I'm beginning with Ezekiel 46, verse 1. Thus says the Lord God, the gateway of the inner court that faces toward the east shall be shut the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath it shall be opened, and on the day of the new moon it shall be opened. The prince shall enter by way of the vestibule of that gateway from the outside to stand by the gatepost. The priest shall prepare his burnt offerings and his peace offerings. He shall worship at the threshold of the gate. Then he shall go out, but the gate shall not be shut until evening. Now, here's one of those verses that tells you that the prince himself is offering burnt offerings, and notice his peace offerings. Now, to be honest about it, I've never met a dispensationalist that believes that the Messiah, if he is the prince, that the Messiah would offer sacrifice for himself. I've never read a dispensational writer that said the prince will offer a sacrifice to make atonement for himself, whether it be a peace offering or a burnt offering at all. The prince does not make sacrifice for himself. So on that ground alone, I do not believe that this can be a reference to this particular part of it, can be a reference to the Messianic millennial or kingdom temple. Your thoughts, William?
Well, I was sitting here thinking as you were speaking, I had someone to send me I don't know whether it was a PDF document or some documentation on the latter chapters of Ezekiel, but they were placed near the beginning of the book. And one of the things that was stated in that, as I vaguely remember, and this has been 2 or 3 years ago maybe, was that it was some attempt on the part of scholars to reconcile the very difficulties that you're talking about in terms of how to assign this either to the the spiritual application or to something that was contemporary. So I wish I could find that document, just like you were talking about that cassette tape. Now I can appreciate it a lot more than when they first sent it to me. So I'm going to see if I can reach out to them and get a copy of it. I'll check my email to see if it's still a reference there. But I think that might be helpful to just take a look at that and see precisely what they were saying now that I have a better scope of what the problem is.
Well, I'm well aware of the fact that there have been efforts down through the centuries to do some rearranging of the text of Ezekiel. And oh, by the way, what's really interesting to me that according to many of the ancient rabbis, chapter 2 and chapter 3 were absolutely forbidden for young Torah or Tanakh students to even read or study. It was forbidden because these were considered so deep, so, may I use the term, mystical, so strange and unknown and almost unknowable that, again, it was forbidden for young Tanakh students to even read or study Ezekiel 2 and 3. So that helps our listeners perhaps grasp a little bit to understand Ezekiel is one of the most difficult chapters of all of the Old Testament. By the way, let me share this. When I was in preacher school, that's what we called it in Churches of Christ. Some call it seminary, and that's fine. But the very first day of our class on Ezekiel, our professor walked in and made the following statement. He said, fellas, I got to tell you, the book of Ezekiel is the most mysterious, most difficult, hard to understand book to me of the entire Old Testament. He said, I've been studying this book for over 30 years. I simply do not understand it. And he said, I'm not going to try to teach you something that I don't personally understand. And, we're sitting there going, okay, this is a class on Ezekiel. How are we going to study Ezekiel if you're not going to teach us Ezekiel? And he continued, and he said, so here's what I'm going to do. He said, I am going to give you, every week, I'm going to give you sermon outlines from the book of Ezekiel. And he said, I hope that these sermon outlines will be of assistance to you in your ministry. Well, at the time we're young preachers, we're looking for sermon outlines. But in retrospect, point number one, I don't have a single one of his sermon outlines. Because, number two, I wasn't impressed with the outlines at the time. And what really, really, really struck me as inconsistent and strange was, well, Professor, if you don't know what Ezekiel is saying, how can you prepare sermon outlines on the book? How do you know that your sermons have anything whatsoever to do with the book of Ezekiel? I just don't get it. And so I basically scratched that class off as a result of that very first day. And of course, you can only imagine what a test on Ezekiel for that class amounted to. there was nothing. There was no substance there. There was nothing. And so, in that regard, that particular class was really, it just simply wasn't much. But he recognized, and he told us, he said, I have spent a lot of effort, serious effort, to understand the book of Ezekiel. I literally have. I've read commentary after commentary after commentary, trying to understand the true message of it. And he said, now, I can explain some chapters in it, but he said, I'm telling you, guys, there's so much of it I just simply don't understand, and I'm not going to try to explain it to you since I don't understand it. Needless to say, that was extremely frustrating to us. It certainly was to me. And so, again, I simply tell all of that to share with the audience how difficult the book of Ezekiel really is. Some of the visions that he explained. You know, I've done more study over the last 15, 20 years of Ezekiel 20 through 39 than I ever have in my life. And there are parts of it that I think that I have somewhat of a grasp of, that are relatively clear. They're not obscure. They're not mystical. You know, they convey a very clear covenantal message. But some of the rest of it is very, very difficult. So, when we come to Ezekiel chapter 46, and we are dealing with a passage that seems very, very clearly to be talking about things that cannot be talking about the Messiah at all, because the Messiah would never have to offer sacrifice for himself, not under any circumstance. Hebrews chapter 5 makes this abundantly clear when it talks about the priest of the temple, and he says, Christ, as the priest of Melchizedek, needs not daily to offer sacrifice first for himself and then for the sins of the people. Jesus didn't need to do that. So this, to me, is the real killer for suggesting any messianic overtones or even undercurrents of chapter 46. Now, what is interesting to me, obviously, is how much emphasis is put on the feast days in this chapter. And that ought to cue us in, at least a little bit, to the significance of the feast days. Now, one could automatically think that because Ezekiel 40 to 47 is about the temple. And the temple was essentially about the feast days. The temple was there as the focal point of the presence of God, to be sure. But it was likewise there for the people to celebrate that presence of God through the observance of the feast days. And without that temple, the feast days literally have no legitimate way of being observed, because the temple is the focal point of all of the feast days. You have to go to the temple to observe the Passover, because the high priest has got to offer that Passover lamb, as Josephus informs us. There were 10,000 or more lambs that would be slain. And he actually says, is it up to 25,000 that were slain in a year at the temple? William, do you remember those numbers?
You said it was 25,000?
Yeah, and the reason I did that is because Josephus said that it was allowable to have up to 10 people, perhaps as many as 20 people, represented by one lamb.
Well,
do you remember that?
Well, yeah, I do remember that. And I've looked at the calculation for those offerings, where they estimate approximately the number of people who were in Jerusalem at the time. And, of course, it was, a huge number, more than what people would assume that, just inhabited the city and round about Jerusalem. But So that was one way where they were trying to authenticate, or at least determine approximately how many people were there. I don't remember the other number, but I do remember that one. And I know, with them saying there were about 10 people per household or whatever, or 20, that gave some idea of how many people were there. I can't think whether or not the other number was mentioned, or at least I don't remember it.
Yeah. Well, some of the numbers are very difficult. An awful lot of scholars have looked at the numbers given by Josephus, and they've said, well, it's just simply not possible because Jerusalem wouldn't hold that many people. Well, if you take the dimensions of the temple, it has been calculated. Jehoiakim Jeremias himself calculated that the temple was large enough to hold 250,000 people. I mean, that was an absolutely massive structure. And so if the temple complex could hold 250,000 people, then you've got to be able to allow for enough sacrifices to account for that many people. That's just what was demanded by the temple cultus, the sacrificial system. So it was, in fact, an absolutely massive thing, and I've said on many, many, many occasions what an incredible sight it must have been. What an incredible experience it must have been to have been in Jerusalem during the feast days and to have seen the multitudes, to see the throngs, to witness what it was like during the feast of Sukkot for the lighting of the lamps. And Josephus describes that, Edersheim describes that, all of these humongous candelabras set up in the courtyard of the of the temple. And when all of those candelabras, and look, folks, these candelabras were so tall and so massive that they had to have men on ladders to climb the ladders to reach the candles, what we would call the candles. And so, I mean, it's amazing to think about the awe-inspiring scope and magnitude of what it would have been like. And what's interesting here, pardon me, is, and what I find fascinating, and by the way, some dispensational scholars and writers have focused on these differences. I want you to notice verse 1 again. Thus says the Lord God, the gateway of the inner court that faces toward the east. Now, we're not talking about the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. We're talking about the inner court. Pardon me, you're either talking about the court of the women or you're talking about the court of Israel. Or, theoretically, you could even be talking about the court of the priest, where they offered the sacrifices. To me, it's a little bit difficult to discern about what is being called here the inner court. But this door that faced the east, it'll be shut for 6 days, but on the Sabbath it shall be open, and on the day of the new moon. In other words, at the beginning of every month, it would be open. There has got to be some symbolism here, and I just don't know. Obviously, you would think if the door is open on the Sabbath, if it's open on the first of the month, then you would think that would signify, that would typify that on the Sabbath, access to the Lord is being open insomuch as was possible under Torah. At least that's my thinking. What are your thoughts on that, William?
Well, I haven't really given it thought before, so but it makes sense that there would be this access. One, because Sabbath is when you consider it from a sort of a temporal perspective, and even from a spatial perspective, it has temple connotations within that because it's the rest, and the temple was the place of rest. So it makes sense that since that is God's resting place, if you please, that there would be access or openness to it. And so from that perspective, it makes sense from what I've studied.
Yeah, well, that was the best thing that I could come up with as I contemplated and I studied today. And I thought, well, what in the world is the significance of the temple being the gate of the temple, of the inner court, being open on the Sabbath and on the new moon? Now, we know that Rosh Hashanah was on the new moon. It was in it was on the first day of the 7th month. And by the way, I still remember your 1st and 10 and 15-yard penalty. So that was definitely helpful to me. So we know that Rosh Hashanah was on the new moon. It was the only, or it was the, I should say, the key feast on the 1st of the month, on the new moon. And, of course, as we have pointed out before, it was the feast for which the Jews, the rabbis said, of that day and hour knows no man, because they had to witness the new moon in order to observe the feast days. So anyway, I found it remarkable that on the Sabbath and on the new moon, not just on Rosh Hashanah now, not on that at all. This is every new moon, the gate would be open. And so right. I see that as indicative of that a new beginning, okay? And that's the connotation that the Jews put on the beginning of the month. It was a new beginning. And then when you had a feast day, on that first day, that truly took on the sense, the significance, and the implication of a new beginning. And this is something that strikes me as I study the feast days.
Well, that's really an eighth day from that perspective.
What now?
I was trying to think from one Sabbath to the next. That would be an eighth day if I'm calculating correctly. If we go from Sabbath to Sabbath, right?
Yes. Okay.
And so I could see kind of what you're saying from that perspective. I'm not sure if it makes sense, if that is in line with what you're saying about this.
No, I'm not following that exactly.
Okay.
I would have to think. I'd have to think on that just a little bit more. The point that I was trying to emphasize was that the Jews linked new beginnings with the first of the month. They linked it with Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah was the day of judgment, but the day of judgment was the day on which men were judged, and the righteous, you see, were judged to have life. And so what you have is they loved to think in terms of new creation. Passover, to a great extent, was a new beginning. It's the first month of their calendar. It's the spring in which you have new beginnings. Then Rosh Hashanah, and as you pointed out to me a couple of years ago now, I guess it was, Rosh Hashanah had like 10 different names. And so many of those names really spoke about new beginning. Yom Kippur gave a person a new beginning because of the atonement. Sukkot, the ingathering to God, and then that was followed by what? Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day feast that followed Sukkot, but Shemini Atzeret was the feast of the new beginning. And so I hope I'm making myself clear here about how much the Jews really thought about new beginnings. To go back to Rosh Hashanah for a moment. Rosh Hashanah is particularly related in Jewish thought, in the thought world. It is associated with the marriage concept. Well, what's a marriage? It's a new beginning. And so there's absolutely no question whatsoever that the Jews they really thought, they really contemplated, they gave a lot of emphasis to new beginning. As a matter of fact, some of the literature that I've read discuss of how Shemini Atzeret is the feast of the new creation. Well, let's not forget that one of the most fundamental eschatological hopes, foundational eschatological hopes of Israel was what? The new heaven and new earth, the new Jerusalem. All of these, quote, new beginnings, new beginnings are associated with Israel's eschatological and soteriological hope. And so it really shouldn't surprise us to find these concepts of the emphasis on Sabbath. Well, what's Sabbath? Well, as William pointed out a moment ago, it's rest. It's God's rest. But Sabbath was, in a sense, it was the end of their week, to be sure. But what did that bring? The end of Sabbath brought the first day of the week. So all of these concepts, I mean, it's difficult, if not impossible, to escape the imagery of new beginning in all of Israel's feast days. You really cannot escape it because it's everywhere you turn. So I as I studied this today, and I tried to dig into, pardon me, and define the typological, and I don't want to use the term hidden wisdom or hidden knowledge because I just don't like that terminology. But nonetheless, as I tried to dig into it, that's the best that I could come up with. And so your input, William, is more than welcome on this.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense, the points that you were making. It's I can't say that I've delved into it as you did, but I certainly think that the ideas that you are expressing with the new moon and every Sabbath and Rosh Hashanah, et cetera, all of those were these new beginnings, et cetera. So it's a consistent concept. I should say that. I think that would be the best way I would assess it at this particular point. It's consistent and it's sensible. And so a lot of times when you can at least get a couple of those things together, it makes sense and could be exactly what's being presented here.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel better because some of this stuff, as we've said from the very beginning, when we began to look at Ezekiel 40 to 47, both William and I were going like, listen, folks, there's a lot here that we don't understand. And pardon me, I don't feel real bad about not understanding, except I'm a person, and you are too. I like answers. I want to know. I want to connect the dots. But let's keep in mind, as we have pointed out before, that when we are dealing with Ezekiel 40 to 47, we are not dealing with chapters that scholars through the years have said, easy to be understood. Plain, simple, no problems here. No. We are not dealing with that kind of passage at all. I mean, we're dealing with some difficult stuff by everyone's admission, just like I shared with you early on, ladies and gentlemen. In the Dead Sea community, among the Essenes, and these are people who spent their entire life from sunup to sundown, with the exception of the time that they were working, planting their crops, to feed themselves. The rest of their time was devoted to the study of the Scriptures. And yet, the Essenes didn't know how to interpret Ezekiel 40 to 47. Some of them took it strictly as a spiritual book, a set of scriptures. It was not talking about an earthly temple in any way, shape, form, or fashion, that it's supposed to be spiritualized. I won't use the word allegory because that's not the proper word to describe how they did it, but they spiritualized it. Others said, well, yes, it is essentially spiritual now. And they even saw themselves, the Essene community, they saw themselves as the fulfillment of Ezekiel 40 to 47. And they did that because of the very last few verses of chapter 47, which we'll get to later. But then they would turn right around and say, even though it's spiritually fulfilled right now in us, the Essene community, one of these days when the Messiah comes, after destroying the Romans, it will be fulfilled physically because the temple in Jerusalem will be purified, cleansed, reconstructed on the grander scale that we find in the book of Ezekiel 40 to 47. So here is all of this ambiguity about the meaning and about the application and about the interpretation of Ezekiel 40 to 47 in the, among the Dead Sea Scroll community that did nothing but study the Scriptures from sunup to sundown. And here's the interesting thing about it. Jesus, in his ministry, so far as I'm aware, never cites, never quotes from Ezekiel 40 to 47. We do find that when Jesus was to be born, the angel said, "You shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. Well, in Ezekiel 47, verse 35, as it closes the entire discussion of this temple, it says, all the way around of this temple shall be 18,000 cubits. Now, folks, let me tell you what. That is humongous. But anyway, and the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. So, about the closest we could come, to an echo of Ezekiel is concerning the birth of Jesus, that it would be, his name shall be called Emmanuel. Now, that's not precisely the same, okay? It's not precisely the same. Concept is similar. So, once again, on one level, I don't make apologies for, at least for myself, for saying, look, folks, I don't understand a whole lot of this. I really do find it, if not mysterious, enigmatic and difficult. So that's on the one level. On the other hand, that analytical part of me that likes to figure things out, that likes to connect the dots, that likes to see the intertextual references throughout the Scripture, and to say, okay, Ezekiel uses this terminology, that terminology is used over here in the book of Revelation. Now, make no mistake, we find allusions to Ezekiel 47 in the book of Revelation. And when we get into Ezekiel 47, we will develop some of those. And we'll see the beauty of those. And we'll see how John was applying them in his day. But that's about the extent of it insofar as intertextuality is concerned. Now, William, do you have any closing comments here? We're basically out of time.
Yeah, well, that's about it. We are out of time. But no closing comments. I think the insights that you've presented have been just that, insightful and certainly intriguing and worth taking some time to go back and look to see if, we can find any additional supporting information for them. But I think it definitely moves in a positive direction. And you certainly got, my interest up, and I will be looking forward to delving into this more.
Very good. All right. Appreciate your comment. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. William, always good to be with you. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.